we are going to, in this video, we're going to talk about adding or subtracting complex numbers. And I'm going to give you a reminder of what a complex number is. So, complex number is a number that can be written in this standard form that you see here, a plus bi. Okay? So this is the standard form of a complex number. And as you know, this first number alone, this a, that's called the real part. And then the b, which is the coefficient of I, that's called the imaginary part. And reminder that I has been defined as the square root of -1. So for example, in this complex number 1 plus 4i, and yes, these complex numbers seem to have like two terms. What it is that they have two parts. The 1 is the real part, and the 4 is the imaginary part. Okay, so in this video then we're going to take these numbers and we're going to simplify them, and we're also going to add them or subtract them. So let's look at the first example. Okay, so the first example, you've got 6 plus the square root of -9. Okay, and this is not in standard form yet, right? So the first step is always going to be rewrite your number, especially if you see the square root of a negative number like you do here. Rewrite that in standard form. Okay, so just going to remind you what that is. So that would mean that the square root of -9 is the square root of 9 times the square root of -1. So I'm going to separate that because I know that the square root of 9 is 3, and now I know that the square root of -1 is I. Right? So there's your imaginary part for your complex number, and then the 6 is your real part. Okay, so that is your complex number in standard form. Let's go to number 2. So now you've got here a square root of a -36, and then you're going to subtract the square root of a -100. And again, your first step will be, let's and I used to say in class, pull out an eye, and kind of reminds me of a vampire movie or a zombie movie, and they're pulling out eyes. But no, what it is that you are rewriting this with an eye, right? So the square root of -36 is the square root of 36 times the square root of -1, and this is a 6, and this is I, right? And then we're going to subtract the square root of -100, which you know is square root of 100, which is 10, and then pull out the I, right? The square root of -1, which is I. And now the good news is that 6i minus 10i, the way that you subtract those is just the way that you might think. It's just like with polynomials where you would keep the I and then subtract the 6 minus 10. So this would be a -4i. Okay, a reminder that this complex number, -4i, where the real part of the complex number is 0. So when you have that single I term looking thing, these we call pure imaginary numbers. Okay, because the real part is 0 and you have this -4i as looks like a, in other words, this is like an invisible 0 that's here. Okay, let's go to number 3. So number 3, you're adding together two complex numbers that are already in standard form. So just as you might guess, we're going to add together the real parts. So the real parts would be -21, and then we're going to add the -8. And then we're going to add together the imaginary parts. So 19i added to a -11i, right? And many of you will be able to do this step without rewriting it, but I thought I would rewrite it to be clear. So here we get a -29, and that's the real part of the answer. And here we get an 8i. So our answer in standard form, -29 plus 8i. Okay, we're going over here to number 4. These are complex numbers in the parentheses, but they are not in standard form. So the first step is get them in standard form. So we're going to pull out i's, right? Okay, but so here's This is negative 6, and then here we have a plus, and it's the square root of 81, which we know is 9, and then the square root of the negative 1, right, the negative 1 is I. So you can do that in your head, or you can write the steps. Plus 11, subtract, okay, square root of negative 144. Square root of 144 is 12. Square root of negative 1 is I. Okay, now you're going to add together the real parts. Negative 6 plus 11 is 5. And then you're going to add together the imaginary parts. 9 minus 12 is negative 3i. All right, number 5. Number 5 says, oh, we're subtracting. So, subtracting two complex numbers. If you think that that means that we are going to change signs with this negative here, we're going to change the signs on both of these terms, then you are right. So let's rewrite that. So negative 9 minus 11i is our first complex number. This is now going to be a plus here, but we are going to change both signs inside the parentheses here to get negative 6 minus 4i. And then we are adding the real parts, which is negative 15. And we are adding the imaginary parts, which is another negative 15i. Okay, and then our last problem, let's rewrite in standard form. So that would be 3 minus square root of 25, which is 5. Pull out the I, 5i, minus negative 2 plus square root of 49, which is 7. Square root of negative 1. Pull out the I. There it is, okay? But next step is change the signs with the subtraction. Change the signs. So let's write that step. So 3 minus 5i plus, now this negative 2 becomes a positive 2, right? Because we're changing the sign. And then this this positive 7 becomes a negative 7i, right? So we're changing those signs. Add together the real parts, which is 5. Add together the imaginary parts, which is negative 12i. Well done.